Blessed is the one who subscribes to this channel. Remember the golden rule. Treat others as you want to be treated.
Welcome to Spirituality in Society.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling something that really surprised me, the way the early Christian church approached their gatherings. We're going to be diving into excerpts from a YouTube video series by Tom Wadsworth. He's a researcher who has spent over 45 years exploring this very question. Get ready, because your assumptions about quote-unquote worship services might get flipped on their head.
You're in for a fascinating ride. What's so intriguing about Wadsworth's work is that he starts with a simple observation that has profound implications. He noticed that when you read the New Testament, the language we use today for gatherings, worship, service, church as a building, it's strangely absent.
Oh wait, really? I have to admit, I've always pictured early Christians gathering for worship just like we do now, maybe, without all the fancy technology and stained glass.
It's a natural assumption. But this is what Wadsworth calls the worship anomaly. And he isn't alone in this observation. Multiple scholars across different denominations have been pointing this out for decades. They've used words like astonishing, startling, even remarkable to describe their findings when they dig into the original texts.
So it's not just one person's unique interpretation. We're talking about a pattern noticed by experts from various backgrounds. This is getting interesting. Can you give me an example of one of these scholars and what they found?
Absolutely. Let's look at Gerd Tyson. He's a prominent Lutheran theologian who specializes in the history of early Christianity. He pointed out that the New Testament emphasizes this strong community focus in gatherings. Instead of, elaborate rituals, the focus was on everyday activities that fostered spiritual growth and connection.
Okay, so if they weren't holding what we recognize as quote-unquote worship services, what were they actually doing when they met?
That's where Wadsworth's deep dive into 15 New Testament passages gets really fascinating. He found that early Christian gatherings were much more interactive and dynamic than we might imagine. They were all about teaching, exhortation, encouragement, strengthening one another, edifying, praying, and singing.
So less about a formal one-way flow of information.
Yeah.
And more about active participation and mutual support.
Exactly. Think about it like this. Instead of solely focusing their attention vertically towards God, a lot of what they did was horizontal, meaning actions directed towards each other for mutual growth and building up the community.
That's such a different picture than the hushed reverence we often associate with church services. It sounds almost like a blend of a support group in a school, but with a spiritual dimension.
We're picking up on a crucial nuance, and this is where a book like 1 Corinthians, specifically chapter 14, becomes essential. Wadsworth argues that this chapter, often overlooked, offers a blueprint for how early gatherings were structured and their purpose, challenging many of our modern assumptions.
Hold on, before we jump into Corinthians, you mentioned a whole bunch of scholars who noticed this worship anomaly. Can we hear a bit more about who they are? It's one thing for Wadsworth to say this, but if all these other experts agree, that adds a lot more weight to the argument, really.
You're absolutely right. The diversity of scholars who've reached similar conclusions is quite striking. We already mentioned Gerd Tyson, but there's also Peter Brunner, another influential Lutheran theologian. Edward Schweitzer, a Swiss scholar, contributed significantly to this discussion as well. Bo Reike, a German theologian, also noticed this pattern in his research. And these are just scholars from the 50s and 60s.
Wow, that's already a pretty broad range of theological perspectives. Makes you wonder how this idea flew under the radar for so long.
It's fascinating, isn't it? And the list goes on. We have Franklin Young, an American New Testament scholar, Aaron Bishop, a Church of Christ scholar involved in translation work, and Robert Banks, an Anglican priest. They all observe this same worship anomaly in their studies.
Okay, so we have Lutherans, Church of Christ scholars, Anglicans. It's clear this isn't just a fringe idea within one specific denomination. Did any scholars from later decades weigh in on this?
Absolutely. Even in more recent decades, respected scholars have continued to highlight the surprising finding. In 1985, Howard Marshall, a leading evangelical scholar, published an article with a rather provocative title, How Far Did the Early Christians Worship God?
Okay, that title definitely makes you want to read on. I'm guessing the answer wasn't a whole lot.
You catch on quick. Marshall argued that the term worship simply doesn't accurately encompass what was happening in those early gatherings. He even suggested that our modern understanding of worship could be obscuring the true nature of what those gatherings were all about.
That's pretty bold. Were there any others who shared Marshall's views?
He wasn't alone. Scholars like David Peterson and John Richardson, both respected in their fields, came to remarkably similar conclusions, despite their different theological approaches. Even Andrew McGowan, a scholar at Yale and an Anglican priest, acknowledged in his book on ancient Christian worship that what we call worship didn't truly exist in the ancient world as a distinct concept.
This is mind-blowing. So we have this wide range of scholars, from the 1950s all the way to the 21st century, all pointing out that early Christian gatherings might not have been about worship in the way we usually think of it. Instead, they were focused on edification, building each other up, and growing together.
That's a great summary, and this raises a crucial question. Could our modern terminology be blinding us to the true nature of those early gatherings? Are we imposing our own ideas and assumptions onto the past, creating a distorted picture?
That's what's so fascinating about this whole deep dive, isn't it? It's challenging us to re-examine our preconceived notions and look at things with fresh eyes. But before we go any further, I'm curious about something you mentioned earlier, this idea of anachronism. Can you explain what that means and why it's relevant here?
Of course. Anachronism essentially means imposing our present-day ideas and concepts onto the past. It's like watching a movie set in ancient Rome and being surprised they don't have smartphones. You know, we do the same thing when we read about early Christians and assume they had worship services just like we do.
So we're taking our 21st century understanding of worship and projecting it back onto a time and context where it might not fit at all.
Exactly. We see the word worship in English translations of the Bible and automatically assume it means the same thing it does for us today. But that might not be the case. Wadsworth spent years analyzing 5 different Greek words that are often translated as worship, and he found that none of them perfectly aligns with our modern understanding. In fact, they primarily related to activities associated with temples, both Jewish and pagan.
Wait, pagan temples too? I thought worship was something that set the Jewish and Christian faiths apart from, those who followed other gods.
That's a common misconception in the ancient world. The concept of worship was much broader and less defined than it is for us today. It often involved very specific actions, often tied to maintaining a right relationship with the deity or deities being worshipped, regardless of which god it was.
So are you saying that early Christian gatherings borrowed elements from pagan practices?
Not quite. It's more nuanced than that. Remember, the early Christians were living in a world steeped in paganism. Their understanding of worship was inevitably shaped by that context, even as they sought to break free from it.
Okay. I'm starting to see how complex this issue really is. It's not as simple as just looking up a definition in a dictionary.
Precisely. And this is where Wadsworth's research gets particularly interesting. He argues that the sacrificial death of Jesus essentially made the physical temple and its associated activities, including what we might now call worship, obsolete.
So if we're stuck on worship as the defining element of their gatherings, we might be missing the whole point. It's like we're trying to fit a square peg into a round hole.
A perfect analogy. And there are other pitfalls to watch out for as well. For instance, panluris is the tendency to find evidence of structured liturgy in the New Testament where it might not actually exist. Similarly, Psychoralis refers to making something more sacred than the text suggests, perhaps elevating certain rituals or practices beyond their intended significance.
It's like we've built this whole structure around the word worship that might be more about our traditions than about what the New Testament actually describes. But if worship isn't the right lens through which to view these gatherings, what is?
Wadsworth offers an alternative, the edification model. This model shifts our focus from a formal, building-centric gathering focused on reverence towards a functional, people-centric gathering focused on growth and mutual support.
So less about awe and more about action. That sounds intriguing. Can you tell me more about this edification model?
Yeah.
What would a typical gathering have looked like?
Imagine, instead of a formal service in a grand cathedral, you have a gathering in a home. People are dressed informally, engaged in lively discussions, sharing their experiences, teaching, encouraging, and challenging one another.
Wow, that's a far cry from the hushed reverence and formality we often associate with church today. It sounds a lot more like a small group meeting or a lively dinner conversation than a formal service.
You're getting the picture. And that's just a glimpse into the edification model. We'll delve deeper into its implications and what we can learn from it in the next part of our deep dive.
I can't wait. This has already been so thought-provoking. I feel like I'm looking at the early church with a whole new perspective.
That's what we're here for, to help you dig deeper and uncover the hidden gems of knowledge that might surprise and challenge you. See you in the next part of our deep dive.
You're invited. Edification Gathering with APM. Are you ready to grow deeper in your faith? Join the Assembly of People in Mission, APM, for a special gathering dedicated to edification, an opportunity to strengthen our connection with God and one another. Our vision is rooted in the greatest commandment, to love Yahweh, our God, with all our heart, all our soul, and all our mind, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. Our mission is clear, the Great Commission, to go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything Yeshua HaMashiach has commanded us. We believe that surely Jesus Christ is with us always to the very end of the age. Join us for this transformative gathering, online or in person. Date, time, and location. The physical address or link to the online platform, along with other details, will be available if you contact us using the number below this video. Whether you join us online or in person, we look forward to growing in faith, mission, and community together. Let's embark on this journey of edification. See you there.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've been exploring how early Christian gatherings might not have been about worship in the way we traditionally think of it.
You know, I have to admit, I'm still wrapping my head around this whole worship anomaly idea. It's one thing to say the word worship isn't used the way we might expect in the New Testament, but to grasp how early Christians actually viewed those gatherings, that's a whole other level.
It definitely requires a shift in perspective, and as we promised, we're going to dig even deeper into the meaning of worship itself. Remember those 5 Greek words Tom Wadsworth analyzed?
Oh yeah, the ones that don't actually translate neatly into worship at all. That really caught my attention.
Yep.
Exactly. Each word carries its own unique nuances, and none of them are directly synonymous with how we use worship today. Remember how we talked about the significance of temples in the ancient world? Well, Wadsworth argues that these 5 Greek words primarily relate to various activities associated with temples, both in Jewish and pagan contexts.
Okay, I need to stop you right there. We're so used to thinking of worship as this purely spiritual, God-focused act. But you're saying it was historically tied to physical spaces, rituals, even sacrifices.
That's the prevailing understanding, yes. And it's essential to remember that the ancient world didn't have the same sharp division between sacred and secular that we do today. Religion permeated their daily life in ways we can hardly imagine.
So going to the temple wasn't just a Sunday morning activity. It was woven into the fabric of their society, their culture, their whole world.
Precisely. And within that context, worship involved very specific actions. It wasn't just about having a feeling in your heart. It was about actively doing things, often with the goal of maintaining a right relationship with the deity or deities being worshipped.
Okay, so now bring Jesus into the picture for me. How did his death and resurrection change this whole system?
This is where things get really interesting. Wadsworth points out that Jesus himself predicted the destruction of the temple. Now, that was a radical statement. The temple was the very heart of Jewish religious life. And with its destruction, the whole system of temple-based worship, as it was understood at the time, was essentially rendered obsolete.
Wow, that must have been a huge theological earthquake for the people living back then. No wonder the early Christians didn't just slot right into existing models of worship. They were operating in a completely different reality.
Exactly. And this is why focusing on the edification model helps us understand this shift. Instead of directing their energy towards maintaining a physical temple and its rituals, their focus shifted towards building each other up, strengthening their community, and spreading the message of the risen Christ.
Okay, I'm seeing the logic here.
Yeah.
But I have to ask, if early Christian gatherings weren't about worship in the traditional sense, what was their primary focus? What was the driving force behind those meetings?
Do you remember that key phrase from 1 Corinthians 14 we mentioned earlier? All things are to be done for edification. That's the core of it.
Edification. Building each other up, helping each other grow in faith and understanding. It's almost like a spiritual self-help group, but with a much deeper purpose.
You've hit on a crucial point. These gatherings were about transformation, both individual and collective. They provided a space for believers to encourage one another, share their experiences, challenge each other's thinking, and learn from teachers and leaders.
So instead of passively receiving a sermon and singing a few hymns, early Christians were actively engaged in a process of mutual growth and development. It sounds a lot more dynamic and participatory than what we see in many churches today.
Absolutely. And remember, these gatherings were happening in homes, not grand cathedrals. The setting itself encouraged intimacy and a sense of community.
I can imagine. It must have felt like a big family gathering, sometimes maybe even getting a bit heated with everyone eager to share their thoughts.
I'm sure there were lively debates and discussions, but that's all part of the process of iron sharpening iron, as the saying goes.
Okay, we've talked a lot about what those early Christian gatherings weren't. But what about the positive side? What can we learn from their approach that might be relevant for us today?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's one that Wadsworth himself grapples with in his work. He suggests that we might benefit from rediscovering the spirit of those early gatherings. We can do this by putting the emphasis back on community, mutual support, and spiritual growth as central elements of our time together.
It's easy to get caught up in the outward forms of our gatherings, the music, the liturgy, the sermons, and forget the core purpose, to build each other up and become more like Christ.
That's a profound insight. It's something we should all be asking ourselves. Are our gatherings truly serving that purpose? Are we creating spaces where people can connect, grow, and be challenged? Or are we simply going through the motions of a ritual that's lost its meaning?
Those are tough questions, but incredibly important ones. This whole deep dive has been a real eye-opener for me. It's like I'm looking at familiar things with a fresh perspective, and I'm already starting to wonder how we can apply some of these insights to our own gatherings today. How can we recapture that spirit of edification and community that seems so vital to the early church?
That's the challenge and the opportunity before us. It's something we'll continue to unpack as we wrap up our deep dive in the next segment.
I'm ready to keep exploring. This conversation has really sparked something in me. I'm eager to see what other insights we can uncover.
We'll be right back to delve into those practical applications and what this all means for us today. Stay tuned.
You're invited. Edification Gathering with APM. Are you ready to grow deeper in your faith? Join the Assembly of People in Mission, APM, for a special gathering dedicated to edification, an opportunity to strengthen our connection with God and one another. Our vision is rooted in the greatest commandment, to love Yahweh, our God, with all our heart, all our soul, and all our mind, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. Our mission is clear, the Great Commission, to go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything Yeshua HaMashiach has commanded us. We believe that surely Jesus Christ is with us always to the very end of the age. Join us for this transformative gathering, online or in person, date, time, and location. The physical address or link to the online platform, along with other details, will be available if you contact us using the number below this video. Whether you join us online or in person, we look forward to growing in faith, mission, and community together. Let's embark on this journey of edification. See you there.
We're back for the final part of our deep dive into early Christian gatherings. This has been a wild ride, hasn't it? It feels like we've unearthed this whole new way of thinking about church.
It's been a journey of discovery for sure. We've challenged some long-held assumptions about worship, and uncovered this fascinating model of gathering that prioritized edification and community.
And I'm sitting here thinking, okay, so what now? This information is incredible, but how do we apply it in our lives today? We can't exactly, hop into a time machine and join a first century house church.
You're right. It's not about trying to perfectly recreate the past, but we can glean valuable insights from the early church's approach and adapt them to our modern context. Remember, those gatherings weren't just casual get-togethers. They were intentional, purposeful, and focused on spiritual growth.
So what would a modern edification model look like? It's easy to get stuck in the rut of our traditional church structures and routines.
That's where the real challenge and the excitement lies. It's about asking ourselves tough questions. What if our gatherings were less about passively listening and more about actively participating? What if we created more space for genuine dialogue sharing and mutual encouragement?
I love that idea. It's like shifting from being spectators in the stands to actually getting on the field and playing the game as a team. Everyone contributes their unique skills and perspectives.
Exactly, and it's about fostering an environment where people feel safe to ask tough questions, grapple with doubts, and challenge each other's thinking. Remember, those early gatherings were likely filled with lively debates and passionate discussions.
Now that you mention it, I can almost picture it. People crowded into a home, debating theology, sharing personal stories, offering advice and support to one another. It sounds so much more vibrant and engaging than just sitting quietly in rows listening to a sermon.
And let's not forget the importance of hospitality. Those early gatherings often took place in homes where people would break bread together, share meals, and truly connect as a family. How can we recreate that welcoming, inclusive atmosphere in our own context? How can we make our gatherings feel more like coming home?
These are all such powerful questions, and I think they apply to all kinds of gatherings, not just Sunday services. What about small groups, Bible studies, even just casual meetups with other Christians? How can we inject that spirit of edification and community into every aspect of our faith?
That's the key, isn't it? It's not about throwing out everything we're currently doing and starting from scratch. It's about being intentional, thoughtful, and open to trying new things. It's about asking ourselves, are our gatherings truly fulfilling their purpose of building each other up and helping one another grow in faith?
This deep dive has been a real game changer for me. It's made me realize that church isn't just a place we go to or a service we attend. It's about how we live our lives, how we interact with one another, how we support and challenge each other to become more like Christ.
Beautifully said. And it's a journey that never truly ends. There's always more to learn, more to explore, and more ways to grow together.
This conversation has left me with so much to think about. How can we breathe that same spirit of edification and community that was so vital to the early church and to our gatherings today? What would it look like to prioritize growth and connection over mere ritual and routine? We leave you with those questions to wrestle with and explore. Until next time, keep diving deep.
Blessed is the one who subscribes to this channel. Remember the golden rule: treat others as you want to be treated.